Good to be with you, church. Today we're going to continue our series in the Beatitudes found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Today we're going to focus on the second of Jesus' 8 statements on blessings. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The Message translates this text written by Eugene Peterson in this way. You are blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. As I've pointed out in this series thus far, the characteristics that Jesus uses to define what it means to be blessed does not align with our understanding of what the good life means. So far in the first two Beatitudes, we've heard, blessed are those who are impoverished and those who are mourning. Now, these are not words that we would typically say are associated with the word blessing. His statement, first statement says, you must be poor enough to receive the blessings of the kingdom. That the poverty of the heart actually forces us to rely fully on God. That statement enough is hard enough to work through. But then he says to follow up, blessed are you who mourn. Blessed are those who are void of joy, for they will be comforted. Now, reading the second beatitude, you would naturally think that maybe Jesus has confused his words. How could a mourning lead us to blessing? How can sorrow be considered a blessing? Now, upon first glance at this statement, it just doesn't seem to add up. He obviously doesn't misspeak. He obviously never misspoke. There's something weird about this statement that asks us to say, like, but Jesus, what does this actually mean? He knows what he's doing here. He's not mistaken. He is pointing to feelings, thoughts, and emotions to build up within those who hear his words an understanding of what the characteristic of a transformed heart looks like. What the characteristics of the life in the kingdom of heaven looks like. He's again doing something that challenges the very makeup of our understanding of the ways of the world and the values of the world. So if we were to understand that this is not a mistake, we have to ask the question, Jesus, what do you mean? What do you mean when you see blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted? Because you can't be saying that you're asking us to be continually sad, right? That doesn't seem logical. But it's important to understand the meaning of mourning in his day. Because mourning in his day was something that was looked down upon. The ancient philosophers considered mourning to be pointless, and like those philosophers, like that mindset, we saw people in that time spend a good deal of their energy, a good deal of their time trying to not mourn. In a really same way, we do so much in our lives to keep mourning at arm's length. Because that is not a great feeling. We spend a good deal of our energy to try to keep that out of our mindset. Now, last week, in a similar way, I suggested that we spend so much of our lives trying not to be poor, either emotionally or resource poor. I think it's important for us to understand that in the same way, we spend so much energy of our lives trying to keep sadness away from us. We don't like to be sad. We don't do sad well. We don't do sad well in our culture. We don't have a mourning idea, how we like to do mourning. We don't like that. And as a church, we've talked about lament over and over again, and we've acknowledged the fact that we as people of faith in this society, we don't like sadness. We don't like to lament. When it comes to mourning in the Western world, we like to get our sadness done and over with as quickly as we can. We want to be able to sweep things under the rug and not have to deal with them. We don't want to have to face up to the deeply rooted emotional issues that we have, that we'll experience because of sadness. In a lot of ways, we just pretend that it doesn't exist, because if we pretend that it doesn't exist, then maybe we can just go on with our lives. Well, I don't think we would say that it's pointless to mourn. I do think we would say we want to try to avoid mourning at all costs. So reading Jesus' words, blessed are those who mourn, we say, no thanks, Jesus. Even if it comes with comfort, even if the blessings are that good, we say, no thanks, we don't want to mourn. But Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn, and when they mourn, they will be comforted. It's hard to avoid this second statement because it comes off the heels of him saying, blessed are those who are poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. It's hard to avoid this. This is the second statement of the greatest sermon that he ever tells. The Greek word translated mourn, it indicates grief that is too deep for concealment. And Jesus is saying, blessed are those who have this experience of a feeling that is too deep for concealment, a feeling that cannot be hidden. He said, blessed are those who feel grief at their core. He's not talking about mere sadness, but he's talking about a disruption of life which feels as though nothing will ever be the same again after it happens. Blessed are those who mourn. In the fall of 1998, I was 12. I know that was a good year for some of you. I was 12. My family had settled into a church in my hometown in Indiana, and one way that my dad decided that he wanted to stay connected with me was through music. I was just getting into choir, and I was feeling like I was a better singer than I was a basketball player at that time in my life. So my dad, in his fatherly wisdom, thought it would be a good idea for us to join the church choir together. Our little church in a town called Mishawaka, First Pres Mishawaka, we joined the church choir together. And I can remember going to that first rehearsal thinking, this is my 12-year-old brain, please don't take offense. I remember going to this choir rehearsal and looking around me saying, man, you guys are old. Again, 12-year-old brain, don't hold me responsible. But we went every single week without fail. We showed up on Wednesday night, we showed up on Sunday morning. And what it did, it provided a space for me and my dad to do something together in that time of my life. He eventually started coming because he would sit next to two guys who became some of his good friends. Two guys who made him sound really good as he sat with them on the bass side of the choir. As a 12-year-old, I remember looking at these guys, and they were like giants. They were like giant men with really deep voices, and I always thought it was really cool. My dad loved sitting next to those guys because he sounded better with them. But not having a changed voice quite yet, what I did was I sat on the other side of the choir between two other guys, one of which you met last year, Alan. Alan and Pam came to worship last year to surprise me. So he sat on my left side, and on the other side was a man named Julius. Julius, by far and away, had one of the coolest male voices I had ever heard. Now, these two guys, they were great. They had a long-standing friendship for many years. They laughed and they joked all the time. They gave one another a hard time. They'd pull innocent pranks on one another and on the rest of the choir. They had a lot of fun together. And it was so apparent how deep their love was for one another. And they took me under their wings. Week after week, year after year, I found myself sitting right between these guys twice a week. I grew up sitting between these two guys, and eventually I became a part of their jokes. I was able to dish out some sass with them. I was a part of their prank plans. I got to be a part of the friend group. And they watched me grow up through those difficult adolescent years. They supported me by coming to the plays and the musicals and the recitals. They offered to be champions of a vision that I had to start a worship gathering experience for my friends when I was a senior in high school. They'd come and sit there religiously singing the songs that we'd sing, whatever we were singing. They were there in times when life was fun and when life was hard. They loved me just as hard as they loved one another. And after a recital for my senior year, Julius, he'd written me a note telling me how proud he was. He was excited to see what God was going to do. But just before leaving my freshman year at Carroll, while riding home, After leading a middle school choir retreat, my friend's mom shared that Julius had passed away just days before. I was just days away from leaving for school, and I didn't really know how much capacity I had to take on all that really what that meant. Partially because I was nervous about what was to come, but partially because I'd never experienced loss like that. I've never experienced loss at that point in time in my life with someone who had such an impact on my life. I remember coming back home from his memorial service a week after leaving, sitting in the exact same spot in the choir loft that I had for years, with my friend Alan sitting next to me, but a very empty chair sitting to my right. And I remember so much of that experience. But the thing I wrestled with the most was the moment I left the loft and that the reality just hit me. Grief just hit me. For the first time, I remember weeping like I'd never before because I was mourning loss. Loss that could never be undone. Loss of a dear friend and a mentor. I was mourning because life had changed from what I'd known and was never going to go back to the way it was before. That feeling of loss, that experience of mourning, that was too deep for concealment. And it wasn't just in the sadness that I felt in that moment, but it was a disruption of my life. It was a disruption that I was never going to be the same. So when I read the words, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," I immediately think about loss. Specifically about loss of a loved one. The pain and the ache feels way too deep in the soul to ever feel like you can recover from it. And Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." But let me be really clear. Pain and ache is not limited to death. It manifests itself in a number of ways. Maybe you've been abused or had a miscarriage or experienced divorce or separation. Maybe you've had a friendship dissolve, you lost a career, or you've been diagnosed with some sort of health condition that is incredibly overwhelming. These things, like death, force us into surprising and unwanted transitions of some kind. These experiences force us into unexpected changes that shift the course of our lives. And I would like to say that these things can be held back, but for as long as that we are here, we will experience these things in our lives. We will experience grief and sadness and mourning because of loss. Each of us will have to wrestle with the grief and the sorrow that comes with the result of the brokenness of this world. So I hear Jesus saying, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And I can't help but think that Jesus isn't knowing exactly how we feel in those times. For he lost friends. For he wept. He was hurt by the reality of a broken world that we live in, and yet he says, "Blessed are those who mourn." Blessed are those who experience such grief, such sorrow. Blessed are those who mourn, but here's the thing about mourning, Jesus says, that mourning can be redeemed. Mourning can be turned into blessing. Mourning can be redeemed. It can turn us towards something so much better. But how? Because in the middle of it, it doesn't feel like it's possible. How can death and loss and sorrow and grief be redeemed? I don't understand. And I don't want to experience any of that because I know what the feelings are. Jesus doesn't promise, though, that you aren't going to mourn. He doesn't say if you're going to mourn. He says when you mourn. That's where he promises comfort. Which leads me to think that while deep sorrow is not fun to walk through, the question that I have is, what if it's not a bad thing? What if it's not a complete loss? Can our mourning truly be redeemed? Like the premise that I started out with this morning, I don't think that Jesus desires for us to experience complete and utter sorrow and hopelessness and sadness in every single second in this existence that we're living. But I do believe that Jesus points us to this statement to say, sorrow and grief of this world reminds us that we are not home. This is not where we belong. This is not the only thing that God has in store for us. Our mourning is to be redeemed. We are meant to know redemption. Mourning and sorrow, those feelings of complete brokenness because of loss or sudden traumatic change, or sorrow because of the brokenness of this world, all of that will happen. But all of that can be redeemed. Those who mourn, they will be comforted. Brad Nelson, a pastor and teacher, says this: the Greek word for mourn is pentheo. It refers to someone mourning the power of wicked over the righteous. This is about the people who are at the bottom, those who feel trapped and helpless and are brokenhearted because of it. This is about the person who works 3 jobs and still can't make ends meet. It's about the parents who read all the parenting books and give their very best to a child who continues to make bad decisions. It's about a student who feels left out and misunderstood and mocked by classmates. It's about the little girl who has been forced into prostitution. In other words, there is not one place in the human story that you will not find a little pentheo, that you won't find a little mourning. This is about all of us. For all of us will experience that feeling of helplessness and being trapped. All of us will be brokenhearted and will be at the bottom. Church, we've all found ourselves here. Each and every one of us, in some way, shape, or form, have found ourselves helpless and trapped, brokenhearted, and at the bottom. And we'll find ourselves there again and again, because the reality is this world is a broken place. We'll find ourselves there because as long as we are here, we will experience the brokenness of this world in ways that we can and will never be able to escape. As long as there is sin in this world, there will be brokenness and sorrow and grief and mourning. And while I want to just think that Jesus is just talking about sorrow over experiencing loss like I did with my friend Julius, there is something so much more that Jesus is naming here. Although we often associate mourning with death, the scope of this verse goes far beyond finding comfort just in times of loss. The second beatitude, it really ties closely to the first beatitude, and it clarifies what it looks like to be poor in spirit. Jesus tells us that those who are grieved over the brokenness and the sin of this world, those who are emptied because of the sorrow that exists because of the brokenness, because of the sin of this world, Jesus says they are blessed. Those who feel inadequate and empty in their faults and their failures, those who know the poverty of the heart that forces you into a situation where you have nowhere else other than to rely on God, they will be comforted. Jesus says those at the bottom, those who feel trapped and helpless and are brokenhearted because of it, they will be comforted. We experience sorrow and grief and we mourn, not because of simply that this world is broken, but friends, here's the reality for us. We experience all of that because we are broken. We'd like to say that it's just the world's fault that all these bad things happen. No, like we play a part in the brokenness of the world. We are the sums of our actions and our decisions and our words. We are broken and at times filled with sorrow because of the world that we exist in. Yes, the world that we exist in, it has fallen from what God has intended. Our sorrow and our mourning is not a result of God not being able to figure out how to make sure that we avoid sorrow. But our sorrow and mourning, it exists because of us. You and me in this world that we live in, because of our desires, because of our rejection of God, because of the world living into the world's ways, we experience mourning and sorrow and loss as a result of what we have done and by what we have not done. And it's there. It's there when we acknowledge how broken and sinful we are. It's there when we say we play a part in this broken world. It's there that Jesus says, those who feel inadequate and empty by their faults and their failures, those who are empty and in their brokenness are driven only to the grace of God, they will be comforted. The great example of mourning over sin is found in Psalm 51. David had been caught in an adulterous affair with Bathsheba, and after being confronted by Nathan the prophet, he wrote these words, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment." These words, this sentiment, this heart is the type of mourning that Jesus is speaking to, that God can redeem. This is the kind of sorrow that God blesses, a heartfelt, sincere grief over the total wickedness of the world and the sin that exists in each of us. That is what can be redeemed. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for those who mourn over the brokenness that exists in this world, and for those who mourn because of the brokenness within each of us." And those who know and experience that this brokenness, this plan is not what God had intended, they will be comforted. They will be comforted by knowing that their sins are covered by God's grace, that this world is not all that we have, and they will inherit the kingdom of heaven because of God's great love for them. We mourn because of the brokenness of this world, loss, trauma, hurt, pain. None of that was the plan. And it's when we realize that, when we realize our emptiness before God, Jesus tells us even the losses of this life that hurt the most can be redeemed. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. When we mourn, not if we mourn. Jesus doesn't say you're not going to mourn. When we mourn, when we experience sorrow over the brokenness and the sin of this world, when we come to know that this wasn't the plan, when we experience comfort. The comfort happens both in this life and the one to come. In this life, there's profound peacefulness that takes place when we understand so deeply within us the reality that we are broken before God. That we are not bound simply by the brokenness of this world that's rooted in sin. We find profound peacefulness that when we come empty, when we realize who God is in light of who God is, we realize we're not bound by the brokenness of this world that's rooted in sin. The comfort essentially is that in the brokenness we experience in this world, this is not eternal. This is not the plan. This is not all that God has in store for us. Brokenness, sadness, hurt, pain, all of that because of our sin, Jesus says, will not be our only reality. It has an expiration date because of what Jesus does. Mourning simply is this way to experience blessing when it's used by God to show us our emptiness and show us our need for a Savior. For there's nothing on this earth, no politician, no actor, no pill, no group, nor religion that can fix what is wrong with us in our world. None of that can relieve us from the brokenness of this world. Nothing. None of that can keep us from experiencing deep feelings of loss, deep feelings because of mourning. But it's only when we see our sin for what it is, when we realize that we cannot free ourselves from the mourning that's caused by this world, when we acknowledge that we truly are trapped, we are truly helpless because of the weight of this world, it's only when we come to understand that we can do nothing but be in a state of mourning because of our own sin and the brokenness of this world. It's only then we can truly experience the blessings and the comforts that Jesus promises his followers, both now in this space and in what is to come. Blessed are those who mourn the reality of this world, for they will be comforted. Psalmist in Psalm 30 says this, "You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy." Church, this is the good news. This is the good news of the gospel, that Jesus says he is willing to comfort those who are mourning. Jesus comforts those who are broken, not just by the weight of the sins of this world, but the weight of our own personal sin. And know that Jesus, he promises that in our mourning, when we are broken by the weight of the sin of this world, our experience can and will be redeemed. Like Psalm 30 says, our mourning will be turned into dancing. Our mourning will be turned into joy. Our mourning, it has a purpose. It will lead us to blessing that will find us comforted by the great comforter, Jesus. It's only in that mourning, only in embracing the reality that we live in a broken world and that we have to face it, and it will cause us to mourn. It's only then that we can understand and be comforted by the great comforter, Jesus. When you're blessed is when you've lost everything that you held dear to you. You're blessed when you feel like you've lost all the things that you hold most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one who is most dear to us. We don't have to lose it all, but when we do, not if we do, but when we do, may we be people who in our brokenness and our emptiness know that our great comforter is there to turn our mourning into a great blessing.